Good morning, crime community. I'm here to continue to read out The Power of Her Sympathy. This is the conclusion of the intro by Mary Kelley. Harry's confidence in his sister was manifest. So, too, was his determination that she cultivate her talent. In asserting that the country must no longer neglect the genius of its women, he laid claim upon Sedgwick to display her own. Harry was also the first brother to persuade her to enlarge the form and scope of the religious tract she had begun after she left Orthodox Congregationalism for Unitarianism. Theodore and Robert then joined forces with him, and they convinced their sister that she novel that emerged from the tract could be published. Having read 130 pages of the New England Tale shortly after its publication in 1822, Theodore told Sedgwick that the novel exceeds all my expectations, fond and flattering as they were. He had never doubted her abilities, but having seen them confirmed, his heart was filled with pride and pleasure. With the publication of Sedgwick's second novel 2 years later, Robert delighted in recounting to his sister that wherever I go, I receive compliments, felicitations, and even homage of the honor I have come to by my relation to the author of Redwood. Charles rejoiced beyond all expression at the progress of the book. He was reading in manuscript. The volume this time was Hope Leslie, Sedgwick's third novel, which appeared shortly after his heartening letter in the spring of 1827. 3 years later, he told Sedgwick in mock horror that she must end her literary career or his family will be ruined. Adults and children alike were looked away in their rooms, absorbed with Clarence, Sedgwick's fourth novel. So long as each was able, all of Sedgwick's brothers stayed the course, prompting, bolstering, and persuading the sister that her talent demanded literary expression. Dedicating Clarence, to my brothers, to my friends, Sedgwick acknowledged their signal importance to her career. The elite standing of her family and the gender conventions of her century intersected in Sedgwick's career. The daughter of an influential Federalist, she nonetheless discarded the political convictions of her father and came to support the more egalitarian democracy she had found so threatening. However, two letters, both expressing Sedgwick's pleasure at favorable reactions to her fiction, highlight a lingering elitism that qualified her support for egalitarianism democracy. In this country, she distinctly informed her friend Louis Manat, we must do everything for the majority. Elaborate upon her responsibilities to those who were numerically dominant, Sedgwick expressed her opinion to the clergyman William Ellery Channing that there was an immense moral field opening demanding laborers. She, of course, defined herself as one of those laborers. Neither pride nor humility could withhold us from the work to which we are clearly sent. In suggesting that elite status entailed particular responsibilities to the larger society, Sedgwick had to address a basic question. Was there any role for individuals of privilege in an increasingly democratic, anti-bellitum America? Despite the thousands of resonated through these decades, America's democracy remained undecidedly limited. Barriers to participation, either as women or as jurors, remained in force for African American men and women of all races. Universal suffrage for white men had made them equal at the polls. In defining the obligations of cultural rather than political, Sedgwick envisioned an elite that might yet be critical to the success of a society that defined itself as democratic. Excuse me. Those who could not longer expect to dominate the polls could retain power and authority in the domain of culture, and there could continue to do everything for the majority. But it was possible for a woman to invest herself with an obligation she had accorded an elite, entitled by her family status to enrich herself intellectually and culturally. Sedgwick took a deep step and defined herself as a particular participant in the construction of culture. She had clung to the political model of elite dominance. She, like all women, regardless of status, would have been excluded from participation in the national project. In combining the increasingly popular idea that women should be moral guardians with a long-standing conviction that culture should be informed by moral as well as aesthetic purpose, Sedgwick was able to circumvent barriers based on gender and transformation, the legacy that Theodore Sedgwick had intended only for his sons. She could now see herself as Channing's equal and insisted that they both dedicate themselves to the work of which we were clearly sent. Simultaneously, however, Sedgwick's elite standing generated ambivalence about the prominence that followed from the exercise of power and authority. Ranked with the early 19th century's most prominent writers, Sedgwick acknowledged the pleasure of distinction, yet she conceded into a journal entry recorded shortly after the publication of Hope Leslie. She decided to, being one of the antebellum American most notable literary figures, and being able to command a high station wherever I go, but that distinction also entailed that her brother Charles, aptly termed Lafayettism, is a condition in which the subject became the possession of her public. Having been introduced to multitudes at Saratoga Springs who paid this compliment to what they deemed my literary success, Sedgwick found the experience distasteful. She had no fritter away in general courtesies, time and thought and feeling. It is a disadvantage that she deeply felt. The Sedgwick thought that the betterment of the same multitudes was obvious, that she sought influence in a cultural arbitrator was equally so. Nonetheless, she still longed for the deference that would have insulted her from the claims an increasingly aggressive public made upon its famous. She had longed to be aloof. The claims that Sedgwick made on behalf of elite women privately pledged conduct that was simultaneously disinterested and deeply informed with moral purpose. The degree of which Sedgwick identified with these attributes can be seen in the reflections on literary women that are scattered through her autobiography and journal. Sometimes the subject she chose was herself. Shortly after the publication of Hope Leslie, Sedgwick recorded a meditation in the meaning of fame. Nothing in her journal that my fond friends expect a great accession of fame to me. She asked herself that spring in 1827, fame, what is it? The praise that has marked the publication of her novel was dismissed as nothing more than a transient breath of man. Fame was welcomed only as it was endowed with purpose, only if her achievements produced something good feeling. Almost as frequently, the subject of other women who had broken ground as participants in the construction of culture, Sedgwick's meditations in this regard appeared almost as reflections in a mirror. In contemplating the other literary woman, the participant of her nation's intellectual and cultural enterprise contemplated herself. Nonetheless, Sedgwick had to look abroad for counterparts during the formative decades of her career. In contrast to the Englishwoman with whom she compared herself, she stood nearly alone as a prominent American writer who happened to be a woman. After Sedgwick had met the English writer Harriet Martineau during the latter visits of the United States in the early 1830s, she devoted one of her journal's longer entries to her. Considering Sedgwick's early reservations about the political economist, the impressions made by Martineau in person was all the more telling. Initially, Sedgwick had thought that the pursuit had such a masculine enterprise, was not the loveliest manifest of women, but Martineau, whom Sedgwick called extraordinary, had allied this concern almost immediately. She had been so modest, gentle, and kind. She had exhibited such a venerable combination of genius and virtue that Sedgwick considered virtue more important because it became obvious in a second entry comparing Martineau to Anna Barbald, Maria Edgeworth, Anna Jameson, and Felicia Hermans, all of whom had been successful in their literary careers. We were studying about Maria Edgeworth, and we will continue to study her in the future days. None, however, had achieved Martineau's prominence. Sedgwick asked herself why. Certainly the others had shown as powerful a genius as hers. Indeed, Sedgwick considered some of them superior in this regard. Nonetheless, Martineau had distinguished herself in her singular comment of God's good gifts to the use of his creatures. She had made the common good the sine qua non of her career. Martineau had also been decidedly inclusive in her definition of those creatures, leaving to others the intellectual amusement or advancement of the gifted and educated. Martineau had focused upon the multitudes. The egalitarianism had made us all cry, "Hail, thou favored among women." The two entries revealed at least as much as Sedgwick as about Martineau, their putative subject. Perhaps most notably, they demonstrated the remarkable agility with which Sedgwick was able to negotiate antebellum America gender conventions, erasing her initial suspicion that political economy was most properly a masculine enterprise. Sedgwick made it practitioner the embodiment of femininity. Still more tellingly, she complicated the common premise that men alone were lords of creation, a popular phrase that signaled the gender conventions limiting participation in the construction of culture and ascribing creativity or genius to Martineau, Barbald, Edgeworth, Jameson, and Herman. Sedgwick openly contradicted those who located generative power exclusively in the masculine. Yet for all the boldness of her challenge, the burden of Sedgwick's commentary was more in keeping with than set against prevailing gender conventions. More strikingly, Sedgwick made virtue a concept increasingly associated with women, an equally important qualification for participating in the construction of culture. Although the precise meaning of virtue was contested among antebellum Americans, all generally agreed that dedication of the common good was central to the definition, and that woman's potential of such dedication exceeded men's. Negotiating the highly charged gender conventions and designed a really identifiable persona from those conventions, Sedgwick had made culture Martineau's domain. Simultaneously, she had done the same for herself. The aesthetic and moral purpose, the disinterested commitment, the identification of women was a newly conceptualized virtue. In short, the strategy Sedgwick employed in positioning herself as a writer all figured in the passages of her fiction. In the original preface of the New England Tale, she described the novel as an effort to add something to the scanty stock of Native American literature that it did. The novel offered its readers contemporary New England in scenery and characters, including a Yankee peddler whom Sedgwick introduced to American literature. In the preface to the second edition, issued 3 months after the novel's publication, the author stressed that a New England tale was also informed by a moral purpose. The novel, she told readers, was written under a sincere conviction of its beneficial tendency. Sedgwick was specifically concerned that her motives must be construed by those who align themselves with the prevailing Calvinism. In a letter written jointly with Harry, she told Theodore that there was no condemnation of doctrines, but only of their abuse in individuals. The statement was normally correct. Doctrinal issues are left aside in the novel, but Sedgwick's sympathies are barely disguised. Her staunch as Calvinist is portrayed as a hypocrite, and her behavior juxtaposed against the exemplary conduct of those who profess a more humane Christianity. Almost certainly, the experience of Sedgwick's sisters influenced the fledgling novelist's portrayal of Calvinism. In her autobiography, Sedgwick recalled that both Eliza and Frances had suffered from the horrors of Calvinism. The impact on Eliza had been particularly destructive. She had been believed its monstrous doctrines, and they had made her gloomy. Once she had been freed from the insidious implications of this doctrinal system, Eliza had experienced an indescribable happiness of redemption from the cruel doctrines of Geneva. In Sedgwick's juxtaposition of characters, both the misery of Calvinism and the elation of release from its doctrines were readily apparent. The novel's primary significance derives nonetheless from Sedgwick's presentation of her heroine, Jane Elton. Sympathy, integrity, and fortitude are combined in Jane with a rare habit of putting self aside. Rare or not, the selflessness exhibited by Jane was a presumed attribute in 19th century women. Sedgwick also invested her heroine with notable strength. Left poor, helpless, and friendless after the death of her parents, Jane refuses to submit to seemingly endless adversities and emerges from her trials resilient, secure, and independent. She emerges as well from her humanitarian impulses intact. Sedgwick's second novel, Redwood, deals with the experiences of another orphaned heroine whose disinterested conduct parallels her earlier counterpart. In the preface of her third novel, published in 1827, Sedgwick informed her readers that she had taken a different approach, noting that she had located Hope Leslie in the 17th century New England. She seemed then that her historical novel had been designed as by means by which others might be prompted to investigate the early history of their native land. She returned to the presentment in her fourth novel, Clarence, a tale of our own times. Significantly, Clarence took exception to those times. Indeed, a novel of damning contemporary on the antebellum America that increasingly made wealth and sole determinant a status. Principled and cultured characters are juxtaposed against unscrupulous and vulgar representations of fashionable society. Satire marks the pages in which the fashionable are mocked and ostentation ridiculed. Sedgwick's primary conviction was unmistakable. Only talent and moral integrity should determine rank. Only those exhibiting both characteristics deserve emulation. Sedgwick changed course yet again in the Linwoods, or 60 Years Since in America, a second historical novel which she published in 1835, set in revolutionary New York, complete with prominent figures including George Washington. The novel celebrates the colonial struggle for independence. In contrast to her criticisms of the Puritans in Hope Leslie, Sedgwick chose to commend this earlier generation because she sought to promote her readers' gratitude to their ancestors, a sentiment that will tend to increase their fidelity to the free institutions transmitted to them. Spurred by the enormous popularity of Sir Walter Scott, Sedgwick sought to cover her nation's past, to kindle interest in her early inhabitants, and to foster cultural identity other than that derived from the former mother country. The highly favorable response to both of Sedgwick's historical novels suggests that she achieved these objectives. When Sedgwick published her last novel in 1857, 22 years had elapsed since the Linwoods had appeared. Her topic was appropriate, the title equally so, Married or Single. Addresses the question Sedgwick posed for herself and considered throughout her journal. The novel Sedgwick acknowledged marriage as the central point whence all the relations of life radiate and the source of all political and social virtue, but she also ridiculed the idea that the matrimonial is essential to the feebler sex and that woman's single life must be useless or undignified, but she is but an adjunct of man. Instead, she said, we believe that she has an independent power to shape her own course and to force her separate sovereign way, but to do what? Not surprisingly, the single woman who had made her own way derived satisfaction from the same sources that had sustained Sedgwick herself. She was a reciprocal relationships forged as sister, friend, benefactor that gave an unmarried woman's life's meaning. The conviction served as a fitting testimony for the woman who had defined herself in relation to others, who had told William Minot that she had my home and many my houses and so many hearts. The same year that Sedgwick presented the Linwoods to the admiring public, she published a narrative that indicated a departure in form of not a substance from the earlier literary endeavors. Fredlow Unitarian Henry Ware Jr. also provided the catalyst, writing to Sedgwick in January 1834. He had invited her to contribute to the series of volumes offering to the public an exhibition of the practical character and influences of Christianity. The form he suggested differed from any that Sedgwick had attempted, a narrative that stood between the formal tale and the common tract. Published in 1835, Home Scene and Character Illustrating Christian Truth did exactly that. During the latter part of the 1830s, 3 similar volumes appeared, all of which were directed toward the inculcation of proper behavior. Poor Rich Man and Poor Man, 1836, insisted that the genuine riches came from the voluntary exercise of those virtues that produced an interchange of benevolent offices. Live and Let Live, 1837, and Means and Ends, 1839, both of which were dedicated to my young countrywomen. lauded domestically as a worthy locus for the woman's identity and stressed participation for her marital role. Simultaneously, Sedgwick continued to publish a steady stream of tales and sketches in annuals and leading periodicals, including Godey's, Graham's, and Harper's. 21 selections from nearly 100 of these tales and sketches appeared in 2 volumes in 1835 and 1844, dominated by the same subjects explored in the novels. They themselves constitute an impressive body of fiction: tangled romances, satires denigrating fashionable society, tributes to contented spinsters, portraits of New England villages, chronicles of ideal marriages, are all handled with stylistic clarity, subtle wit, and unusual grace. In a letter that is emblematic as of the devotion Sedgwick inspired in virtually everyone with whom she shared herself, the youngest of her siblings told her that she had been in the recipient of many gifts. By far, the one for which she should be most grateful was the most obvious: the power of your sympathy, as Charles described his sister's deep and sustaining identification with others. The destination was appropriate for both Sedgwick, the person, and the gender conventions of her century. In her autobiography, in her journal, in her fiction, in short, in all her writings, she has insisted upon the signal importance of connection in her relations with others. Indeed, she has presented herself as entirely interwoven with others. 19th century gender conventions also located in women a special capacity for selflessness, also privileged connection as feminine. Yet Charles neglected to mention the equal significance that Sedgwick attached to the freedom to choose for oneself, based on the premise that women had a claim on individual fulfillment. Choice had enormous implications for women in a century in which they were expected to subordinate themselves to the needs and desires of men. In her writings and the most important decisions taken in her life, Sedgwick made these implications tangible. The issues she selected covered a broad spectrum. Decisions regarding religious affiliation, vocational commitment, and marital identity were included in her domain. The gender conventions of her century constructed connection and choice almost as a binary opposition, inflected a feminine and masculine. Choice appeared possible only for men. But Sedgwick deconstructed this opposition and made connection and choice complementary imperatives for both sexes, insisting that women should freely and fully choose a life for themselves. She suggested that only then could they just as freely and fully practice connection, no longer marked as exclusively feminine. Connection could only be mutual, practiced for men and women. In this, and as such, she displayed the insight, so as Charles phrased it, the myth of her sympathy that made her autobiography, her journal, compelling. That is the end of Mary Kelley's introduction to the power of her sympathy. Catherine Margaret Sedgwick's journal of her life and times. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I did reading it. We have several other books that we're still going to cover about Miss Sedgwick, and then we'll probably move on to Miss Edgeworth. Like and subscribe, and have a nice day.